So thank you for having me back again today, or this evening. Again, I'm Paul Terrio with Plante Moran. Tonight we're going to be talking to you a little bit about building utilization. Last meeting, Paul Wills, my colleague, and I spoke really around enrollment projections mostly, kind of where you've been enrollment-wise, where you are, and where you're headed. Tonight we're going to talk about building utilization, which is kind of the next logical step. So we have X number of kids, we have X number of instructional buildings, but what does that look like on a building by building basis, and what does that really mean? So we'll talk a little bit about the process that we used and talk through some of the buildings we looked at, and then what that looks like, you know, from our last presentation on grade configurations, kind of how the buildings are structured. Look at some of the floor plans. We're not going to look at every single building floor plan, but we grabbed an elementary, a middle school, a high school, and then a couple of the other buildings. And then, you know, what does it all mean? So obviously, part of our assignment was to look at all the district's facilities, and when we get to the part where we talk about the needs on a maintenance and operations and construction basis, we'll talk about all of them. For this piece, we really just focused on the instructional buildings. So really kind of the first 15 there. Interesting tidbit, if you look at all of them, the average age is 1970. So doesn't seem that long ago, but 53 years, the buildings definitely age along the way. Not to date anybody here, but so really, when we were walking buildings this summer, looking at things like mechanical systems, electrical systems, we were also looking to see, you know, how did the buildings look? Were they full? Were there empty classrooms? Were some classrooms being used as storage? Just kind of how things were configured, and they're all a little bit different, but it's helpful to go through and look while we're inside. And then we also worked with the administration, specifically I'd like to thank John for all his help. And some of the building principals to understand exactly how their buildings were laid out. This is really a snapshot in time, so because we were walking in the summer, it was easier to look back at the previous semester, so last spring semester, not forward. So if you see a floor plan and you say, hey, this room moved, I think it's over there now, that's probably true. There are probably some moves that happened over the summer. But really it's a snapshot from pretty much June of 2022, or 2023, sorry. And what we tried to do is pull everything apart in a way that if we ever need to put it back together, it's easy to do. So we essentially broke spaces into 5 different categories. One is, and we looked at things that could potentially be a classroom. So a space that was a classroom previously, or a space that could easily be converted to a classroom. We're not looking at conference rooms and main office spaces or gymnasiums as much, or media centers like we're in tonight. We're really looking at what spaces could be utilized or had been utilized as classroom spaces. And within that, we looked at general ed classrooms, dedicated classrooms, things at the elementary level like art, music, tech. Obviously there's specials, what I hear they're called a lot from my kids. So there's a first grade classroom. They get up and they go to art for an hour and then they come back. So we don't want to double count those, right? Because that's the same class using a different space. So we try to segregate out those a little bit differently. And then special education classrooms, other support classrooms, and then vacant or non-utilized classrooms are really the 5 different categories. And another thing to note, we're not looking for 100% utilized buildings. That would be probably a little bit impractical, right? That would mean if 10 more kids show up in the fall, there's nowhere to put them. So really the rule of thumb is about 85% is probably kind of the sweet spot. And if you think at the middle school and high school level, the teachers have prep hours as well. So those classrooms aren't necessarily utilized 6 out of 6 hours. They're probably utilized 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 7, depending on how the day is structured. If you look back 30 years ago, a lot of those classrooms were utilized every hour of the day because there were so many kids and the buildings were overflowing. The teachers would leave and go down to the lounge or go somewhere else. Nowadays, we don't see that a lot. So just a reminder from the last meeting, kind of what the enrollment numbers look like. You can see, again, K-5 is, fairly stable. The high school, a little bit less so, and then the middle schools actually were showing ticking up about 150 or 200 kids over the next 5 years. So again, this is on a head count basis, not an FTE basis. So first example we have tonight is Country Oaks. So if you look at the classroom, we're literally trying to figure out which grades are in which areas. Some classrooms are larger than others. Kindergartners by code are a little bit, and by design are a little bit larger than some of the other spaces. And those are green, so all the general ed classrooms are green. The orange classrooms are those specials we talked about, art, music, tech. The purple are more some of the support spaces. So if you see the PBIS room, that was probably a classroom sometime in the past. Now it's being used as kind of a support space. The lit lab, somewhat similar. The EL space, I don't know if that was ever a classroom or not, but that wall in between could probably come down pretty easily, and that could be a classroom if needed. Bill will probably tell you there's code issues with egress and things like that, so some are easier to make a classroom than others, but in a pinch, if you needed to, that would be a classroom type space. We tried not to look at every little nook and cranny and shoehorn classrooms and be overly optimistic about what could happen or not. We know there's support spaces within a building that need to be there for, whatever it might be, title rooms, resource rooms, speech pathology, whatever it might be. So, and then there's one room at Country Oaks that currently, or at least last spring, was not being utilized. So really, there's a lot of different ways to do utilization, and we'll get into the spreadsheet in a minute, so to speak. You could just say how many classrooms are general ed divided by the total. That'd be probably the simplest way to do it. You could also look at it a lot of different ways as far as what is the typical classroom size, and it's different at every grade level. It's different at the high school than it would be in a kindergarten room. Kindergarten's usually about 20 kids. High schools could be 30 or even 32 in certain districts. I have one district I work with where it's 40. Not optimal, of course, but for that district, that's what their standard is. So what are we doing? We're really just gathering data. We're trying to pull the building apart so that we can understand it better, so that when we put it back together, so to speak, we have all the facts and all the data. This is Muir, so we just kind of grabbed the first one alphabetically from the middle schools and elementaries, middles, and highs. You can see, again, there's primarily general ed classrooms. There's a couple of special ed classrooms. This is the ground floor. A tech lab space that's not being currently used. And then there's 4 classrooms kind of in the back. 2 of those are the old, probably media center or computer labs, which, as we all know, a lot of that's changed over the years. There's a lot of Chromebook carts and mobile learning devices and things like that. Not as many hard labs as there used to be. I actually did a bond a few years ago where the first thing we did was add a second lab to every building, and by the end of the bond, we took them all back out again. So as the state changes testing requirements and things like that, some of those things change along with it. So, and then this is up on the second floor. You can see there's another, 9 classroom type spaces up there. One's special ed, one's a resource room, and one's open. So. The high schools are a little more challenging. Things move around there a little bit more, but you can see a lot of green classrooms, a few open, a couple special ed, a few support spaces. There's a few other spaces too, like the lab off the media center. There's some large group instruction rooms and spaces like that. We tried to be pragmatic about it and not count every single space as a classroom, but be realistic about what we thought would make sense. And then in the lower level, you can see a lot of orange down there. That's just the way that we showed the IA program, and we kind of counted that as its own building, so to speak, even though it's at Lakeland, because it's its own high school. So you can see IA down there, and then there's one empty room. So that's it kind of for elementary, middle, and high school. Then you got the Brooks Center. So there's obviously a lot of different programs there. The green is kind of the alternative high school. The purple's the support, a couple special ed classrooms, and then a couple of open classrooms. And then Apollo, after the renovation, you can kind of see where everybody is at over there as well. So a lot of green, but a lot of support spaces as well, and a lot of special ed there. That's a good one too, because obviously at an early childhood center, class sizes are a lot smaller than they are at the high schools. And depending on the age, they can be even smaller than that. So, how do you look at it, from last fall versus where you're at this spring? Again, what we're really trying to do is generally get a direction. You could nitpick the exact percentages if you really wanted to, but we're trying to get a direction of, at the elementary, middle, and high school level, are we at healthy percentages, or is there something to be concerned about? So this is the eye chart a little bit. So we kind of chopped everything up again into those 5 different colors. And then column F is really if you were to add those all together. So you can see there's about 369 general ed classrooms in the district out of a total of 509. And then what we did for the utilization calculation is we ignored the dedicated classrooms, the art, the music, the tech, right? Because those are the same kids moving over. So we kind of ignored those from the calculation. We ignored special ed because those programs need a home and we're not looking at moving them around. So we really looked at general ed, the support, and the vacant, which is column G over there, about 448. And then that's your total enrollment there in the last column. One thing to note too is there are some junior kindergarten classrooms at some of these buildings. So those got noted on the floor plans as general ed, and we included those enrollment counts. When we did our enrollment projection presentation last week, I think those were below the line. They probably weren't in the numbers, so to speak. There's some programs that we kind of put below the line. And we did the 5-year projection a little bit differently for those versus the algorithm we use for general ed. But if you look at the student enrollment here and then versus the capacity, so the typical class sizes, we had a lot of conversations around that of what the right numbers were. We think those are pretty close. So we looked at 20 at junior kindergarten, 22 at kindergarten, 23 first, 24 at second, 25 for third through fifth, and then 30 at the middle schools and high schools, and 25 at the alternative high schools. So that's kind of how we did the math out for all of those. And then really column J kind of shows you the excess capacity at different buildings. So you can see some of them it's pretty minor. Some of them it's a little bit larger. But again, don't get bogged down in all the detail because there's a lot of it. What I'd really want you to focus on is kind of the overall percentages at the elementary level, 84%. So what we kind of lead off with, we really want to be about 85. That's right where you want to be. There's some that are up in the 90s, some that are a little bit lower, but overall your elementary schools seem to be pretty well utilized. At the middle school level, it's down at 58%. That's definitely on the low side. There's a little bit of difference there between Muir and Oak Valley and White Lake, but overall, that's probably lower than it would want to be. So, and then at the high school, same kind of thing, right? Those high schools, as we talked about last week, 30 years ago, probably had 1,800 kids in them. Now they've got 11, 12, 1,300. So they're a little bit underutilized, as you would expect. And then same thing with the Brooks Center and Apollo is, again, a unique, early childhood center is very unique, depending on how you drill down with all the different programs offered from year to year. I think that one feels better. It feels more healthy of where it would want to be, considering how small the class sizes are. But the middle schools and high schools are definitely of concern. We actually broke it apart too, just by grade level, trying to understand how many first graders and second graders and third graders were at each building. Again, this is based on last spring semester. Again, just making sure we didn't miss anybody and that we really understood, exactly how many sections were at each building, knowing that things do change. So kind of key takeaways. Enrollment, as we talked about at the last meeting at the elementaries, is pretty strong. It's 400 to 500 at most of the buildings. Highland's a little bit lower. That's a little bit geographically of an anomaly on the edge of the district. But the rest of them all seem in that 400 to 500 range, and are all within 80 to 90% utilized, which is pretty good. The middle schools are about 500 to 600 students. They're all more down in the 55 to 65% range. Again, that's usually when we would say we should talk about, are there ways to optimize that or to look at some different potential things there. And then same thing at the high school. You know, the percentages are low, but what does that mean? Sometimes that's a good thing. It could mean that you've got the potential to do a lot of spaces like you guys talked about this evening with CTE spaces or collaborative spaces, flexible spaces. You know, you think of the media center we're in tonight. The media centers looked a lot different 30 or 40 years ago than they look today, and that they're going to look in the future. So maybe it's an opportunity to do some different things and do some creative things and make some of the spaces community resources or things like that. Doesn't necessarily mean that the sky's falling, but it means there's a potential there that should be looked at. And that's kind of probably what we'll talk about a lot at the next meeting, which will be more around, okay, we've got some things to talk about. Now, what kind of an investment do I need to make in these facilities to bring them up to speed? A lot of it, you guys have already started with the bond at the elementaries and at the high schools now. What are the remaining costs and investments that need to be made at all the buildings? Because no matter how much money you invest, there's always more need than there is money. And even though you just renovated the elementary schools, and we'll talk more about this the next time, there are things that weren't done that still need to be done. And even the brand new things have a useful life. And sometimes that useful life, if it's carpet, is only 10 years, or if it's a roof, it's only 20 years. So how do you take all those things into consideration along with enrollment, along with utilization, and make the best decision for the district long term?